Have you ever paused in solitude and asked yourself, who am I, really? Not just your name, not just your place of birth or the job you hold, but the deep-rooted origin of your being. Have the stories passed down through family, culture, and religion truly revealed your identity? What if the narratives taught in schools and sanctuaries were not lies, but only half-truths, fragments missing their most crucial pieces? What if the tribes of Israel were never lost, as tradition has often claimed, but instead intentionally hidden, silenced by centuries of conquest and colonial manipulation? Today, we dare to lift the veil from a story obscured by time and deception. This is not sensationalism. It is not myth. It is scripture. It is history. It is prophecy fulfilled. And it is deeply personal. Their exile was not merely geographical. It was ontological. They were stripped of name, custom, memory, and heritage. In Genesis, the eternal God proclaims, "And I will make of thee a great nation." His 12 sons became the patriarchs of 12 tribes, the foundations of an identity based in fable, but in fact. It doesn't freeze in the Old Testament. The narrative of Israel is not one of closure, but one of ongoing revelation. Prophecy and history now stand in divine agreement. These descendants of Abraham did not merely face slavery in Egypt or find liberation through Moses, but of preservation, a divine vault designed to safeguard the identity of God's covenant people. They would endure one of the most sweeping and systematic identity erasures in human history, a spiritual genocide by erasure, not extinction, for centuries, without influence from Roman Catholicism or European Judaism. They maintained the Torah, observed the Sabbath, practiced circumcision on the 8th day, and honored biblical dietary laws. They preserved not only the canonical texts, but also apocryphal scriptures like Enoch and Jubilees, books removed from Western Bibles, yet preserved in Ethiopia's sacred canon. Their priestly structure is not a borrowed concept, it is an ancient retention, passed down through generations untouched by Greco-Roman religious systems. But their story doesn't rest only on culture, it is confirmed by genetics. Scientific studies have revealed the presence of the Cohen modal haplotype, the unique DNA marker associated with the Levitical priesthood, the sons of Aaron. Let that sink in. This is not legend. It is molecular evidence echoing ancient promises. This is not coincidence. It is prophetic continuity. Then in 586 BC, Babylon crushed the southern kingdom, destroying the temple and exiling Judah. It is where God hid the seed of Abraham, preserved across centuries of conquest and colonial erasure. This wasn't just exile, it was divine foresight, a scattering with purpose, a concealment with a promise of future revelation. To be taken back into Egypt by ships was a prophetic metaphor, and more chillingly, a literal foretelling of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. These were not fringe groups or proselytized converts. They were communities whose traditions mirrored ancient Hebraic law and whose DNA bore the marks of ancient Israelite lineage. Their rituals, linguistic roots, and ancestral memory align remarkably with ancient Hebrew customs. They to circumcise on the 8th day, on a Sabbath rest, and follow laws akin to kosher regulations. Their names bear striking resemblance to Hebrew names, with linguistic structures reflecting Afro-Asiatic language roots. This is not cultural imitation, it is ancestral remembrance. Some would return, but the majority were dispersed again, becoming strangers in strange lands. The question remains, where did they go? And shall all families of the earth be blessed, Genesis 12:2-3. This promise is not symbolic, it is not metaphor, it is a covenant or contract, eternal in its scope and divine in its authority. We are about to unfold what may be the greatest cover-up in religious history, the concealed identity of the true children of Israel. This isn't simply an issue of race, culture, or theology. It is a profound revelation with implications for all of humanity. The Bible does not begin with Israel as a nation, it begins with a covenant, a divine promise made not in palaces nor on pedestals, but in the humble obedience of one man, Abraham. From Abraham, The promise passed to Isaac, and then to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, the one who wrestles with God. But here lies the twist. The story doesn't end in Canaan. While they were called to be a light to the nations, that light was buried, suppressed under conquest, colonial rule, and ecclesiastical distortion. Yet God, in his omniscience, had foretold it all. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other. Deuteronomy 28-64. This was not poetic metaphor. It was a roadmap of dispersion. In 722 BC, Assyria swept into the northern kingdom, enslaving 10 tribes. While Western historians often trace Jewish lineage through Europe, the biblical and historical trail leads us into Africa, a land not only of refuge throughout antiquity. Jewish communities were not only present, but deeply rooted in African regions in Egypt, Sudan, and most significantly, Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Beta Israel stands as a towering testament. Moving west, we encounter the Igbo people of Nigeria, often referred to as the Jews of West Africa. In Ghana, the Ashanti and Akan peoples preserve ceremonial rituals and purification rites that mirror the Levitical practices outlined in the Old Testament. In Sierra Leone, the Limba people maintain oral traditions that trace their lineage directly to ancient Israelites. Africa, long viewed through colonial eyes as a land needing salvation, was actually the sanctuary of a scattered people. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. Deuteronomy 28-68. Here the scripture speaks with terrifying precision. Egypt, in the biblical idiom, symbolizes bondage, which people in world history were chained, forced onto ships, and sold into nations across the seas, who had their language, names, identity, and spirituality erased. Their condition matched the curses of Deuteronomy with shocking exactitude, who endured centuries of forced labor, lynching, and theological dehumanization under the claim that they were cursed. But in light of Deuteronomy 28, we must ask a deeper question. Was this also a spiritual event? Could it be that this tragic history was actually the manifestation of divine prophecy? These people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, carried the covenant in their blood, even as they were stripped of every external marker of identity. Their DNA bore the promise, even while their tongues were silenced, their names replaced, and their traditions buried. The answer is not a mystery. It is written on the broken backs and unbroken spirits of African ancestors who were stolen from West Africa and dispersed into the Americas and Caribbean. If the prophecy was fulfilled in bondage, then the prophecy will also be fulfilled in restoration, in ritual, in oral tradition, in bloodline. In the Akan and Ashanti communities, Levitical purification rites persist in ceremonial form, and in Ethiopia, the Beta Israel still sing psalms in a manner unchanged for centuries, untouched by Western Christianity, rooted in Torah fidelity. What has been hidden will be revealed. What was scattered will be gathered. What was silenced will now speak. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen. It is more effective to erase their identity, rewrite their history, and disconnect them from their spiritual roots. The colonizers of Africa knew this well. Their strategy was not merely to exploit the land, but to reprogram the mind to replace memory with myth, truth with theology, forged in the crucible of empire. Why is this story absent from pulpits and seminaries? And that their only redemption lay in serving a God who looked nothing like them. The Cohen modal haplotype, a unique marker passed down through the priestly line of Aaron, has been found among the Lemba people of Zimbabwe. These findings were not sought, they emerged from neutral scientific inquiry, and yet they shout a truth long buried. The priesthood survived. The promise endured. Deuteronomy 28-68. This was not a poetic flourish. This knowledge was stolen, but it was never lost. For the Most High never forgot. What man tried to erase, God preserved in oral traditions, in secret customs, in bloodlines stretching across the coasts of West Africa and the highlands of Ethiopia. And where the center of Scripture was relocated from the hills of Judah to the cathedrals of Rome and Paris. It was a roadmap of captivity, fulfilled with excruciating accuracy in the slave ports of Elmina, Ouidah, and Goree Island. The remnant is remembering, and no lie, no doctrine, no empire can stop the restoration of God's covenant people. This isn't just history, it's prophetic fulfillment. They demonized ancestral spirituality, much of which retained fragments of Israelite worship. The Sabbath was replaced, circumcision was discouraged. Festivals rooted in Torah were erased and replaced with ecclesiastical traditions. The transatlantic slave trade is often discussed in terms of brutality and economic exploitation. The biblical passage declares, "The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee." The middle passage, with its death ships and chains, becomes not just an atrocity, it becomes a sacred marker, a point of divine witness. But herein lies a profound and redemptive truth. If the curse was real, then so is the promise. "Though I make a full end of all nations, yet will I not make a full end of thee." Jeremiah 30-11, the story of the 12 tribes, doesn't end in diaspora. In fact, Africa becomes the living vault in which their identity is preserved. Take the Igbo people once again. Not only do they follow Hebraic laws, they also possess genealogies, linguistic structures, and festivals that align with Old Testament practices. Even genetics affirms what Scripture declared long ago. So why then, if the evidence is in Scripture, in blood, in tradition, and in science, why has this truth been hidden? The answer is as spiritual as it is political, because identity is power. To conquer a people, one does not need to destroy them physically. And so a new gospel was crafted, one where the Messiah bore European features, where the prophets looked like Greco-Roman sages. They outlawed Hebrew customs in African communities, deeming them pagan. They didn't just alter doctrine, they altered imagination. And in doing so, they severed generations from their true biblical heritage. The colonizers' version of Christianity became a weapon, one that taught enslaved Africans that they were cursed, that their suffering was divine punishment. But this distortion was never the truth. It was a theological deception, engineered to keep a chosen people spiritually sedated, historically disconnected, and theologically subjugated. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Hosea 4:2-6, knowledge of who they are, where they come from, and what the covenant truly means. And now, the prophecy spoken by Amos is beginning to stir. "I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall never again be uprooted." Amos 9:14-15. This is not a poetic metaphor. This is a spiritual uprising, a divine awakening. But to fully embrace this restoration, one must confront the distortions that have shaped religious identity for centuries, especially the distorted image of the Messiah himself. For centuries, stained glass windows and Renaissance canvases have painted a Messiah whose image reflects European ideals rather than biblical truth. Yet Scripture offers a very different portrait, one that challenges the colonial lens and invites us back to the authentic identity of Yahushua HaMashiach, known to the world as Jesus. His head and his hairs were white like wool, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. Revelation 1:14-15. This is not poetic abstraction. It is physical description. Hair like wool and feet like burnt brass are not features of a pale-skinned figure, they are features that resonate deeply with African identity. Hair that coils, skin the hue of polished bronze scorched in a furnace. This is the description of a dark-skinned man, not the sanitized image born of European iconography. Yahushua was from the tribe of Judah, and Scripture affirms that this tribe are dark-skinned. The prophet Jeremiah laments in Lamentations 4-8, "Their visage is blacker than a coal, and who were the ancient Egyptians? Their own murals, tombs, and papyri show them as deep brown-skinned Afro-Asiatic people." Africa was both a place of refuge and a guardian of truth. The land that once cradled Moses would also cradle the Messiah in his infancy, symbolizing the preservation of God's promise even amid oppression. A people once cast as outsiders are now discovering that they have been at the center of God's covenant story all along. The resemblance between Israelites and Egyptians was not accidental, it was familial, visual, genetic, because the moment a people see themselves in the Word, they are no longer invisible. They are no longer forsaken. They are no longer enslaved by imposed narratives. Moses looked like them because he came from a shared ancestral geography and phenotype. In Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, communities are finding that their elders preserved rituals that align line for line with the law of Moses' ritual purity, animal sacrifices, head coverings, circumcision, and sacred festivals. These are not accidental parallels. They are ancestral memory alive in motion. And again in 5:10, our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. These are not allegories. These are eyewitness laments grounded in real affliction and real appearance. This is not a trend. It is not a mere cultural revival. They are embracing the Torah. They are observing the Sabbaths. They are rediscovering the feasts not as foreign customs, but as ancestral commands buried under centuries of suppression. It is prophecy made visible, a divine recall of a people who were scattered and silenced, now rising to reclaim what was theirs from the beginning. Moses himself, upon fleeing Egypt, was mistaken for an Egyptian by the daughters of Midian. Exodus 19. What does this mean for us today? It means the Messiah was not born into whiteness, but into black lineage, into a community that bore the weight of prophecy, the burden of covenant, and the mark of divine selection. He was born of a people who would one day be scattered, enslaved, and forgotten yet never abandoned. Out of Egypt have I called my son. Matthew 15, Hosea 11-1. Yahushua's connection to Africa was not incidental. It was prophetic alignment. This truth is not a revision, it is a restoration. And as it unfolds, it becomes not just a theological correction, but a spiritual revolution. This is not about race supremacy. This is about identity recovery. And today, this awakening is echoing across the world, from the streets of Brooklyn to Lagos, from the favelas of Brazil to the villages of Sierra Leone. A spiritual stirring is spreading like wildfire. Across the Americas, Hebrew Israelites are waking up to the truth that their ancestors were not merely victims of history, but fulfillers of prophecy. Meanwhile, throughout the African continent, believers are reconnecting with Mosaic traditions, often without knowing that what they practice mirrors ancient commandments. This is the fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision, the valley of dry bones, once lifeless, now rattling with resurrection. Son of man, can these bones live? Prophesy unto these bones. And they stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Ezekiel 37:3. 10. The bones are shaking. The silence is breaking. This is not religion in costume, it is revelation clothed in righteousness. As the Apostle Peter once declared to the early church, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. 1 Peter 2-9. That message echoes now, louder than ever. To those who descend from those who endured the ships, the chains, and the cross-Atlantic hell, you were never cursed. You were never forgotten. From the beginning, you were chosen. You were marked by covenant. You are the children of Abraham, the seed of Jacob, the living echo of a people hidden, but never erased. And now, the Most High is calling his people not first to a land, but to an identity. Not just to return to Scripture, but to the truth buried under the rubble of conquest and colonial lies. In the place it was said to them, you are not my people, though it will be said to them, you are sons of the living God. Hosea 1:10. That place is here. That time is now. If these words have stirred your spirit, know that you are not alone. You are part of an awakening, part of a generation called to remember, not just for history's sake, but for destiny's sake. Before Abraham, before Moses stood barefoot at the burning bush, before Israel had even been named, there were people who already knew, revered, and worshipped the Most High, What if everything you thought you knew about the origin of Yahweh worship was incomplete? This isn't speculation. This is biblical archaeology, linguistic evidence, and ancient memory speaking in unison. He welcomed Moses. He gave him his daughter Zipporah, mentored him, and offered burnt sacrifices to Yahweh. Exodus 18:12. And chief among them were the Shu, or Shasu. Moses, the lawgiver of Israel, lived under Jethro's roof for 40 years, not learning idolatry, but deepening his understanding of the true God. The man named Jethro, also known as Ru, appears in the pages of Scripture not as a pagan, but as a priest of Midian and non-Israelites, yet worshipper of Yahweh. This powerful truth opens a forgotten door, that the worship of Yahweh predates Israel, and that other peoples, Semitic, Afro-Asiatic nomads, already knew the divine name. They occupied strategic highlands in Canaan, Transjordan, Petraea, and Arabia. To Egypt, the Shasu were heretics, carrying a name that defied the pantheon, but to history, they were forerunners of Israel's covenant, keepers of a sacred name, guardians of divine memory. They had a tribal confederation, and among them, the Shasu of YHW stood apart. During the reigns of Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, engraved into the annals of Egypt's military campaigns are stone inscriptions that speak of Yahweh before Moses ever uttered his name on Sinai, whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God. They were part of a broader priestly heritage of Semitic peoples who had preserved the name of El Elyon, the Most High God, before Israel was even born. He was from Uz, believed by many to be within or adjacent to Edom, the land of Esau, Jacob's brother. Job, likely a descendant of Abraham through Esau, lived outside the formal Israelite covenant. Yet the entire book of Job centers on his direct communication with Yahweh, his understanding of divine justice, and his theological depth far surpassing many of the prophets of Israel. They testify that Yahweh's name was not introduced to humanity at Sinai. Rather, Sinai was the formal covenantal moment, a public declaration of a name already known in the wilderness. Scripture gives us further evidence of this ancient worship and the lives of other righteous non-Israelites who stood outside the covenant line, yet walked closely with the God of Israel. Mention a subgroup of Shasu worshipping a deity, YHW, an early rendering of the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, the divine name of Israel's God. To the Egyptians, the Shasu were desert nomads, sometimes portrayed bandits or rebels, but Egyptian inscriptions from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. This reference is more than intriguing, it is earth-shaking, because it predates the Mesha Stele, long believed to be the oldest extra-biblical reference to Yahweh, by more than 500 years, but always intended to be the God of all nations, selecting Israel not for exclusion, but for mission. Could it be that Yahweh was already known, already worshipped, and already feared by ancient peoples long before the formation of Israel as a nation? Yes, and the evidence is carved in stone. The Shasu were not an insignificant tribe. They were a spiritual insurgency. They resisted Egypt's imperial theology. So revered was Melchizedek that even Abraham gave him tithes. The New Testament later calls him a type of Christ, Hebrews 7, whose priesthood is eternal, not tribal. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Seti I waged war against them not merely for political power, but to quell their growing spiritual influence. The Shasu of YHW were not an isolated anomaly. Consider Job. There was a man in the land of Uz. Job 1:1. Job was not a Hebrew. Then there is Melchizedek, that mysterious king priest who appears in Genesis 14. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High El Elyon, and he blessed Abram. Genesis 14:18-19. Melchizedek predates the Levitical priesthood, yet is described as the priest of El Elyon, the same Most High referenced in Israelite worship. These men, Job, Jethro, Melchizedek, and the Shasu of YHW, form a pre-Israelite priesthood. As Moses himself declares in Deuteronomy 33:2, the Lord came from Sinai, and dawn from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran, Seir the land of Esau, Paran a region tied to Midian. Moses does not locate Yahweh's presence solely within Israel, but acknowledges that his glory was radiating from lands outside the covenant, among peoples like the Kenites, the Midianites, and the Shasu. Could it be that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was never meant to be a tribal deity? This is not to diminish Israelites, to magnify Yahweh, whose voice was heard before any scrolls were written, whose name was preserved on the lips of desert dwellers, whose presence was honored by priests with no pedigree. I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. Isaiah 65:1. The implications are profound. We must recalibrate our theology. The story of God does not begin with Israel. Israel begins with God, who was already moving, speaking, and revealing himself to outsiders, faithful remnants whose stories were long buried. Let us now return to the Shasu of YHW, a people whose name was not whispered in mystery, but carved into stone by their enemies, the Egyptian pharaohs. These were not disorganized nomads. They were a formidable force, militarily resilient, spiritually defiant, and politically dangerous to one of the greatest empires in history. They planned revolts, controlled highland territories, and most threatening of all, they invoked the sacred name, YHW. Among those tribes were the Shasu of YHW, and their threat was not just political, it was theological. And Egypt responded accordingly with war, with inscriptions, and with campaigns meant to crush these insurgents. They carried the name of a god not recognized by Egypt, a name that challenged the authority of Ra, Amun, and the entire Egyptian pantheon. The Egyptian victory stele of Seti I, preserved in Karnak, speaks not only of the battles waged in Canaan and Transjordan, but of the Shasu tribes who dared to rebel. They defended it, they carried it across deserts, whispered it in caves, and cried it out in battle. They didn't have scrolls, but they had oral transmission, to remember a name he had forgotten, to be reminded, not by a Levite, but by a Midianite priest, Jethro, of who Yahweh truly is. It tells us that God was never confined to a single lineage. Instead, he was weaving his name into the hearts of righteous men and women across nations, tribes, and tongues. They didn't have temples, but they had mountaintops, and the name endured. When Ramses II, the great builder pharaoh, launched military expeditions into southern Canaan, he did so to suppress the rising influence of the Shasu. It doesn't undermine Israel, it glorifies Yahweh, who was already working redemptively through forgotten peoples, before any temple was built or covenant codified. To bear the name of Yahweh in ancient Egypt was to carry a revolutionary identity, to declare allegiance to a monotheistic, transcendent, covenantal God in a world ruled by pantheistic empire. Yet they could not erase the name. "You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain." Exodus 22:7. The Shasu did not profane the name, they protected it. What if their devotion was not an accident, but part of a divine prototype, echoing forward into the mission of the Messiah himself? Before Israel had priests, the Shasu had sacred memory. Before Sinai thundered, they had already bowed. Could this be why Moses fled to Midian, not only to hide, but to learn? The power of this revelation is staggering. It reshapes our understanding of worship, of spiritual history, of covenantal continuity. The name Yahweh was never a possession, it was a calling. And the Shasu carried that calling with divine conviction. This emerging picture doesn't dismantle scripture, it deepens it. As the Apostle Paul would later write, "Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice." John 10:16. What if the Shasu of YHW, the Midianite priests, the Kenites, the Edomite sages like Job, what if they were the first whispers of these other sheep? Let's trace the path. Melchizedek, priest of El Elyon, king of Salem, offering bread and wine and blessing Abraham before Israel had a law. Jethro, priest of Midian, guiding Moses in the earliest stages of his prophetic calling. Job, righteous sufferer of Uz, holding long complex dialogues with the Most High, centuries before the prophets, and the Shasu of YHW, resisting empire while carrying the covenant name etched not just in hearts, but in hieroglyphs. All of them preceded Sinai. All of them worshipped Yahweh. All of them were forgotten by religion, yet remembered by God. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. Deuteronomy 33:2. Notice the progression. Sinai, Seir, Paran, Israelite regions. Scripture itself places the radiance of Yahweh's presence not within the boundaries of covenantal Israel alone, but among peoples outside the camp. These weren't pagan nations inventing gods. These were nations echoing the divine, carrying sacred fragments passed down through ancient channels of faith. An age in which the faith has been commercialized, homogenized, and disconnected from its roots. The modern church has inherited a gospel that often begins with Rome, moves through Europe, and offers little room for the wilderness voices that carried the flame before doctrine gave it walls. Why does this matter? Because we live in an age of spiritual amnesia. But Scripture says, before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. We are standing at the awakening in the middle at the moment when bones rattle, when names return, when identity rises from exile. Isaiah 65:24. It was whispered in forgotten tongues and carried in clay jars. It flowed through tribes the world despised, but heaven embraced. The voice of Yahweh has always gone before his people, a people who will no longer look to cathedrals to define their identity, but to the ancient testimony written in blood, culture, and stone. Who were the Shasu? The question is, it was heard in the caves of Petra, in the incense of Midian, in the songs of Cush, in the mountains of Paran. Now, as history trembles and faith is tested, God is raising up a generation to remember. We are not standing at the beginning of the story. So now the real question is not, what will you do with their legacy? Will you pass it by as a theological curiosity? Or will you, like Moses, like Job, like Jethro, like the Shasu, remember the name? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24:15.